Imagine police breaking into a quiet suburban home and finding a son living under the same roof as his mother's rotting corpse. That's not the beginning of a horror movie. It's the chilling reality deputies faced in New Mexico on April 2, 2024. What started as a confusing 911 call quickly spiraled into one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever witnessed. The call came from a woman named Rhonda King. She was panicked, her words jumbled, barely able to give an address. Dispatchers strained to make sense of her cries, catching only fragments. Something about a man, his dead mother, and a fear that he was about to hurt himself. It sounded strange, maybe even exaggerated, but officers were sent to check it out. When deputies arrived, they found 59-year-old James Colbert. He was sweaty, nervous, and had blood smeared across his shirt and face. He didn't appear violent, but he was clearly in emotional turmoil. According to Rhonda, James had locked himself inside the house, talking about how he had no reason to live anymore. She worried that guns might be inside. She insisted his mother had passed away but hadn't been taken from the home. Nothing about the situation added up. Deputies cautiously approached James. They patted him down for weapons, nothing. He allowed them to check his pockets and handed over some keys. At first, the scene seemed like it might be a sad but routine welfare check. A grieving son struggling after the death of his mother. Yet something about his behavior nagged at the deputies. He seemed evasive, insistent on locking doors, and oddly concerned about things like alarms and property instead of the body of his own mother. The responding officers started to wonder, was this simply grief, or was there something James wasn't telling them? By the end of the night, they would have their answer, and it was far darker than anyone could have imagined. To understand how things reached this horrifying point, we need to look at James Colbert's life before April 2nd. James was in his late 50s, a man who had spent years living with and caring for his elderly mother, Marion. She had been battling Parkinson's disease, a condition that slowly robbed her of her strength and independence. Friends and neighbors described her as a sweet, fragile woman who relied heavily on her son for day-to-day support. James's role as caregiver seemed simple on the surface, but behind closed doors, the arrangement was far from easy. Living with a parent in declining health can create enormous pressure. Friends said James was deeply tied to his mother, but over time the stress appeared to wear him down. He didn't work a steady job and was often isolated. Marion's care became his world. Rhonda King, a longtime friend and former girlfriend of James, remained in his orbit for decades. Their relationship was complicated, part companionship, part tension. She knew about his struggles, and on April 2nd, she was there with him when everything spiraled out of control. According to Rhonda, James wasn't just grieving, he was unraveling. She told deputies that he had talked about having no reason to live. She feared he might have access to firearms, because months earlier, James had filed a police report after a burglary at the house, claiming weapons had been stolen. Whether those guns were still around was anyone's guess. At first glance, it looked like the story of a broken man watching his world collapse after losing the only person he lived with. But there were red flags. Why hadn't James called 911 when his mother died? Why was her body, according to him, still in the home? And why did he seem more concerned with door locks and alarms than with grief or funeral plans? These questions would soon push deputies to dig deeper. What they found behind that locked door would confirm Rhonda's worst fears and open up a far more sinister story. When deputies pressed James for details, his answers only made things stranger. He said his mother had passed away the previous day, just sitting in her walker in the hallway. He admitted he left her there for hours before realizing she was gone. His explanation was simple: he was in shock. But deputies found it odd that no one had been called. No doctor, no paramedics, no funeral home. Just silence. James insisted he hadn't tried to hurt himself, but he wouldn't stop talking about securing the house. He wanted doors locked, alarms set, and the property safe. To the deputies, it sounded less like grief and more like a man desperately trying to control the scene. Eventually, deputies convinced James to hand over a key so they could check on his mother. As they approached the home, the unease grew heavier. They made announcements at the door. "Sheriff's department? Anyone inside?" But silence answered back. Once inside, the smell hit them first. Then they saw bloodstains leading toward the bathroom. In the shower, traces of blood confirmed their worst fears. As they searched further, they found Marion. She wasn't in a bed as James had described. She was slumped in her walker, her body bearing injuries that didn't look like the result of a simple fall. Deputies noted lacerations, bruising, and damage to her skin. Details that suggested something violent had happened. James, meanwhile, showed little reaction when told his mother's body had been found. Instead, he asked about his dog. He wanted to know if deputies had let the animal outside. That cold detachment unsettled everyone at the scene. It was no longer just a welfare check. The home had transformed into a crime scene. Deputies secured the property, seized James's phone, and prepared to take him in for questioning. What they had stumbled upon was not the natural death of an elderly woman, but something far more sinister, wrapped in secrecy, lies, and unanswered questions. At the sheriff's office, James was read his rights. He agreed to talk, but his story raised more questions than it answered. He told detectives that his mother had fallen off a chair, and that he helped place her back onto it. He claimed she later died sitting in her walker. According to James, this all happened around 11 a.m. the day before deputies arrived. He admitted he left her there for more than 15 hours before realizing she was gone. The problem was, her injuries didn't match that explanation. Investigators noticed deep lacerations on Marion's shins and bruises that looked like blunt force trauma. Medical experts explained something called tissue bridging, a sign that the wounds had been caused by repeated impact, not a simple fall. Detectives pressed James, but he stuck to his story. He denied harming his mother, insisting she had simply passed away, and that he hadn't called for help because he didn't know what to do. His detachment was chilling. He spoke about the death as if it were an inconvenience, not the devastating loss of the woman who had raised him. While James sat in interrogation, deputies at the crime scene documented evidence. They photographed the blood in the bathroom, the injuries on Marion's body, and the unsettling condition of the home. They also spoke with James's brother, John, and sister-in-law, Lisa, who rushed to the station when they heard the news. John and Lisa painted a haunting picture. They said Marion had been terrified of James in her final years. She confided to them that he would lash out, yell, and make her fear for her safety. According to them, Rhonda, the friend who had placed the 911 call, had even told them that James admitted something dark, that he had killed his mother. The weight of their statements, combined with the physical evidence, began to crush James's story. What had first looked like a tragic case of a son losing his mother now pointed to something much darker: possible murder. With James in custody, prosecutors began piecing together a case that would have to stand up in court. The physical evidence was grim. Blood inside the house, Marion's injuries that experts said didn't match a fall, and the disturbing condition of her body left unattended for days. Added to that were statements from Rhonda, John, and Lisa, each pointing toward James as the one responsible for Marion's death. Investigators believed that tension in the home had escalated into violence. James, already under stress as Marion's full-time caregiver, may have snapped during an argument. Whether it was a moment of rage or something more deliberate, the injuries suggested force had been used against her. Prosecutors leaned heavily on this evidence, arguing that Marion had not simply fallen but had been beaten. During questioning, James never confessed. He stuck to his story that Marion had died naturally and that he was overwhelmed, but his inconsistencies were difficult to ignore. He first said she fell off a chair, then that she died sitting in her walker. He claimed he hadn't called 911 because he was in shock, yet deputies noted how calm he seemed when they discovered the body, more worried about his dog than his mother. As the case moved forward, the community was stunned. To outsiders, James had been the loyal son caring for a frail mother. To prosecutors, he was a man hiding behind that role while harboring darker impulses. Court hearings focused on forensic reports, the timeline of events, and the strange behavior James displayed during his mother's final hours. Witnesses described Marion as a gentle woman who feared her son's temper. Others recalled James's erratic behavior in the days leading up to her death. The trial painted a picture of a fractured family dynamic, where caregiving had turned toxic. For the jury, the question was simple but heavy. Was James a grieving son overwhelmed by loss, or was he a killer trying to cover his tracks? In the aftermath of the arrest, the case left a deep scar on the family and the community. Marion Colbert, once described as a gentle and kind-hearted woman, had met a tragic and brutal end inside the very home where she should have felt safest. Her death forced neighbors and relatives to reconsider what they thought they knew about James, a man they believed was dutifully caring for his aging mother. The sheriff's office continued to investigate every angle, gathering forensic evidence, interviewing family members, and preparing for what would likely be a lengthy legal battle. Meanwhile, James sat behind bars, awaiting the next chapter of his fate. For some, there was no question of his guilt. For others, there lingered a chilling uncertainty. Could this truly have been the act of a grieving son who lost control, or was there something even darker hidden in his mind? Marion's other children, John and Lisa, were left devastated. They spoke of her final years, how her body weakened, but her spirit remained strong. They also spoke of her fear, how she hinted that living with James was not always safe. Those haunting words now rang louder than ever. True crime cases like this resonate because they touch on a primal fear, that danger doesn't always come from strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it comes from the very people we trust the most. A mother and son, bound by blood, sharing a home built on decades of memories, only for that bond to unravel in violence and silence. The story of James and Marion Colbert is a reminder of how fragile the line between care and control can be. It's about how grief, isolation, and hidden conflict can twist into something unimaginable. And it's about the tragedy of a woman whose last chapter was written not by illness, but by betrayal. As the legal system works through the case, one fact remains unshakable. Marion deserved dignity, respect, and love in her final days. Instead, her life ended in fear and violence, and her story will be remembered as one of the darkest crimes to ever emerge from an ordinary neighborhood.